Brian Seltzer hosts the pre and the post game for 76ers basketball on 97.3 ESPN. And he also provides content for Sixers.com, and you can follow him at Brian Seltzer on Twitter. And Brian, I've really been, and thanks for all the tweets you've been putting out, because I've been following you a lot. I think you've done a really good job of keeping people informed on the pair of Sixers that are at the Olympics. But the one thing I want to get from you is there's been a lot of people who have been critical of what the Sixers have done and are watching Saric and kind of saying, when's this guy going to start scoring, or when's he going to play defense? And I think there might be a misconception out there of what type of player Sixers fans should expect when they get Saric, and kind of get from you what you're seeing from him and how you think that might translate into the NBA game.
Mike, I feel like I'm as guilty of this as the next guy, where when you're trying to look at a player that stands out to you or interests you, like, well, if something isn't maybe going as easily as you would want it to or hope, you're like, well, what's this guy not doing correctly? Instead of also taking into account whether it's a player or a team, what's the person or the team on the other side doing? I mean, these first two games between Spain and then Argentina last night, Saric at times in the games has gone up against legitimate, proven NBA talent. Game number one against Spain, Nikola Mirotic from the Bulls. At other times, Pau Gasol. That's who he had to contend with. And then against Argentina, it might have been Andres Nocioni at times, who's been overseas the last couple of years, but did have a good run in the NBA, even had some time with the 76ers. And then a guy like Luis Scola. So Saric, he's definitely gone up against some seasoned, experienced players that have gotten some time in the NBA. But I think that one of the storylines to track going into tomorrow's game for Croatia against Brazil, again, another team that has guys like Marquinhos in the NBA, or Nene, who's still is going into his 16th year in the NBA on their team, is what Saric can do to build off that fourth quarter from last night's game, because things started to open up for Croatia offensively a little bit more. Saric had success cutting the bucket a few times, whereas earlier on in the game he had to settle for mid-range jumpers, the top of the arc. So it seemed like he got into an offensive flow last night. His final numbers were terrific, just the fifth double-double in the entire Olympic tournament, with 19 points, 10 boards, and 7 assists. So that's what I'm going to be looking for going into tomorrow's game, what Saric can do to build off of last night's showing.
Yeah, he had a double-double with the assist, and him and Rodriguez tied for fourth in total assists. We'll get into Sergio in just a bit, but isn't that the type of player that fans should expect from Saric? He's not a elusive scorer. He's an energy guy. He's a glue guy. He's a guy that hustles. Is that the kind of guy that the Sixers are hoping they get?
In just looking at these last two games, it really does seem like, more than anything else, he's been around. He's been active and contributing at all ends of the floor. The guy has logged a ton of minutes in not just two Olympic games. He played the entire second half last night. But think about all the basketball Saric has played in recent months. He has, he's been at the Olympics for 2 games. Before that, for Croatia to get in, they were part of the qualifying tournament. In turn, they played a handful of games there. Saric and Anadolu Efes played deep into the spring, making a run all the way to the final round of the Turkish Basketball Super League final championship tournament. So he had a ton of postseason games there. There was EuroLeague. So Saric has played a lot of basketball, and he's still bringing some consistent high-energy plays. So I think that maybe more than anything else, that's something that stands out to the 76ers, and something that when you're trying to figure out what type of player he might be at the NBA level, it's at least encouraging to see the guy has some grit, some toughness, blue-collar, dynamic to his style of play, and a guy who has some stamina and some energy.
Yeah, no doubt. And as you chronicle at Brian Seltzer on Twitter, fourth quarter last night, 11 points, 3 rebounds, 2 assists. He played all 20 minutes in the second half. He had that big block shot. What do you think of his defense in terms of how he'll match up defensively against guys? I know small sample size, but I chronicled this before you jumped on, Brian, which was he is actually getting to see some NBA talent. You mentioned some of the guys, Gasol, Scola. It's not like he's playing non-NBA players every single minute of every single game. So what do you think of his defense?
No doubt in that first game against Spain, there were times, especially early on, where a guy like Pau Gasol posed some matchup problems for Saric. Gasol maybe can do a little bit more. Certainly, he's 14 years older, I think, than Saric is, and he's had his fair share of accomplishments in the NBA. So I don't think that was necessarily something that was unexpected or totally unreasonable to see. But as you just said, Mike, Dario hung in there and especially came up with that clinching play, the block at the end of the game to save it. He just seems like a guy extremely versatile on the defensive end. If you even look back at some of the still photographs, and sometimes you don't always pick up on this stuff while the game's playing out, he had to switch out on Sergio Rodriguez at times in that game against Spain. So he's a guy that if you watch, he's just kind of hovering in and around that, let's say, 6 feet territory around the basket, 6 to 8 feet. He'll switch out at times, but for a Croatian team that doesn't have a ton of size, yeah, he's had to take on some really tough matchups against experienced players on the block. And he's a guy that's shown that he's, again, fought through it while trying to adjust on the fly.
Brian Seltzer's with us. Give us your impressions of Rodriguez and, maybe what we can expect from him, because I think he's a lot less heralded or anticipated, but he's got a decent resume himself and a former NBA player himself. So what have you seen from him in these Olympics, and what do you anticipate his role being when he plays in Philly?
I think he seems pretty steady. He hasn't started either of these first 2 games, but, and this is something that, coaches in any sport at any level always talk about. It's not always who starts, but how games end. Rodriguez has been on the floor for Spain at the end of 2 really close games, the 2-point loss on Sunday to Croatia, and then the 1-point setback to Brazil yesterday. So Rodriguez was the guy that was on the floor. Yes, Ricky Rubio from Minnesota fouled out yesterday, but still, it just has seemed to the naked eye like there's been more order and flow and steadiness to Spain, especially on the offensive end, when Rodriguez has been out there. He shot a little bit more efficiently in the second game against Brazil than he did versus Croatia on Sunday. And as far as where he might fit in, it's still really, really early, but I think what you're able to take away from this, again, so that you mentioned, he's a guy that's had a ton of professional experience, not just in the NBA, but at one of the highest levels, playing for Real Madrid over in Spain, won a league championship there, was an MVP. So he's coming back to the NBA. He did an interview, I think it was with Hoops Hype, earlier this week, where he's just talked about, he really wants to prove himself at the NBA level. So I think you're going to see a focused guy, a more mature guy, and someone who it looks like could definitely contribute at the NBA level for the Sixers.
Yeah, no doubt. And if anything, there should be some good ball movement with Simmons, Saric, Rodriguez. Those guys look like they really have a knack for finding the open guy.
That's one of the fun things about watching Dario Saric, too, Mike, is that we heard Brett Brown mention that he has a similar skill set to what you might see out of Simmons, and I think that's been apparent in, again, just the 2 games in the Olympics that we've seen, but also if you've gone back and watched any footage from his games overseas, that definitely seems to be the case. But for the Sixers, no doubt they're going to be looking for guys to, with all those passers, step up and shoot the ball a little bit as a backcourt, you would think, try and figure out what rotation they're going to establish in the front court. And it's amazing that in just about, let's say, 6 weeks' time, we're going to start to get a better sense of that when the Sixers gather up for training camp.
I can't imagine there's been a more highly anticipated season, since maybe Bynum, when Bynum, who never stepped on the floor, but that was pretty anticipated. But can you remember one that had so much excitement behind it for a team that won 10 games?
Well, I think even more so than that, 2012-2013 season with Bynum is that there really seems to be a core and nucleus being established right now full of promising young players for the Sixers, whereas going back 4 years, they were coming off that exciting playoff run, and he's throwing someone like Bynum, and who knows what can happen, but still the Sixers had to sacrifice some talent in order to pick up Andrew Bynum, whereas now you're starting to see the seeds of something that could be lasting be sowed and put into place. So who knows exactly how things will shape out for the Sixers by the end of April, but definitely it feels like there's this genuine and valid sense for thinking that we're going to see some tangible signs of progress this year with some of the incoming young talent and then some of the veterans that they're going to be sprinkling in thanks to the signings in free agency.
Well, follow Brian Seltzer at Brian Seltzer on Twitter if you'd like to keep up to date on how Dario and Sergio Rodriguez are doing at the Olympics, as Spain unexpectedly 0-2. Croatia is 1-1. Saric and Rodriguez both getting a lot of minutes for those two teams, and Brian breaks it all down over at his Twitter page at Brian Seltzer and over with the Sixers as well at NBA.com. Brian, great stuff, and make sure you guys follow him if you want to keep up with those guys. Thanks, Brian.
Mike, thank you, man.